The world just entered uncharted territory. For the first time in decades, the two largest nuclear superpowers have no limits on their arsenals. And now, the US is making a bombshell accusation against China that could reshape global security forever. What's going on, everyone? Today, we're breaking down a major development in international nuclear politics. The United States has just accused China of conducting a secret nuclear weapons test back in 2020. And the timing couldn't be more significant. This comes just one day after the last major nuclear arms control treaty between the US and Russia officially expired. So let's unpack what this all means, why it matters, and what could happen next. Alright, so here's what happened. On Friday, a top US State Department official named Thomas DiNanno made this accusation at a global disarmament conference in Vienna. He didn't hold back. DiNanno claimed that the US government has evidence that China conducted nuclear explosive tests, specifically one with a yield in the hundreds of tons on June 22, 2020. Now, what does yield in the hundreds of tons mean? Basically, he's talking about the explosive power of the test. To put it in perspective, we're talking hundreds of tons of TNT equivalent. Not massive by nuclear standards, but significant enough to be concerning. But here's where it gets interesting. DiNanno also accused the Chinese military of trying to hide this test. He said they used something called decoupling to cover their tracks. What's decoupling? Imagine digging a massive underground cavern to conduct your test. The empty space around the explosion absorbs some of the seismic waves, making it much harder for monitoring stations around the world to detect what you're doing. It's essentially a nuclear sleight of hand. According to DiNanno, China did this deliberately because they knew these tests would violate their commitments to the international test ban. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone actually detect this test? Well, that's where things get a bit murky. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, or CTBTO, is basically the world's watchdog for nuclear weapons tests. They have monitoring stations all over the globe that detect seismic activity. Their executive secretary, Rob Floyd, came out with a statement saying their system did not detect any event consistent with the characteristics of a nuclear weapon test explosion on that date in June 2020. Floyd mentioned that their system can typically detect nuclear tests with a yield of about 500 tons of TNT or greater. For reference, they've detected all 6 tests that North Korea has conducted and declared. But here's the catch. DiNanno said the alleged Chinese test had a yield in the hundreds of tons, without giving an exact number. So if it was on the lower end, say 200 or 300 tons, it's possible it could have slipped under the radar. Arms control expert Daryl Kimball explained that if this was a very low-yield test explosion, it's entirely possible it could be hidden from the monitoring stations, especially if decoupling techniques were used. So what does China have to say about all this? Well, the Chinese embassy in Washington pretty much denied it. Their spokesperson, Lu Pingyu, said China follows a no-first-use policy on nuclear weapons and adheres to its nuclear testing moratorium. He also flipped the script a bit, saying it's the US that should be earnestly abiding by its treaty obligations and commitments to a nuclear testing moratorium. Basically, China is saying, we're following the rules and you should be too. But here's the thing, both the US and China signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but neither has actually ratified it. Russia even withdrew its ratification back in 2023. So technically, the treaty isn't even in force, which means those additional verification mechanisms that could detect smaller explosions can't be used. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Why now? Let's zoom out for a second. Just one day before this accusation, the New START Treaty officially expired. This was the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the US and Russia, and it placed limits on how many nuclear warheads and delivery systems each country could have. Without it, there are now 0 constraints on the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals for the first time in decades. President Trump and his administration have been pretty clear. They don't want to be bound by New START anymore. Instead, they're pushing for a new, broader agreement that includes not just Russia, but China as well. Trump has even called for the resumption of U.S. nuclear weapons testing, saying it should happen on an equal basis. In his remarks, Dinano suggested that this alleged Chinese testing was part of the reason for Trump's position. He also mentioned that Russia has been accused of failing to maintain its testing moratorium by conducting what are called supercritical nuclear weapons tests. So essentially, the U.S. is saying, look, if China and Russia are testing or preparing to test, why should we be the only ones holding back? Now here's where things get really interesting. Dinano said, February 5, 2026, marks the end of an era, the end of U.S. unilateral restraint. While he didn't explicitly say the U.S. would immediately deploy more nuclear weapons, he strongly hinted at it. He mentioned that the U.S. would complete its nuclear modernization programs and that they have non-deployed nuclear capacity that could be used if directed by the president. The big question everyone's asking is, how do you get China to the negotiating table? Beijing has consistently refused trilateral arms control talks. Their argument? Their nuclear stockpile is way smaller than those of the US and Russia, so why should they be part of the same conversation? But here's a counterargument from Matthew Kronig, an expert at the Atlantic Council. If China really believes their stockpile is smaller, wouldn't they want arms control to limit US and Russian weapons? Unless, of course, they're planning to build up their arsenal to superpower levels. Kronig thinks that's exactly what China is doing. Some U.S. officials believe that letting New START expire and potentially expanding the U.S. arsenal might actually create enough concern in Beijing to bring them to the table. The logic is, if China sees the U.S. building up its nuclear forces without limits, they might feel pressured to negotiate before things spiral out of control. So where does this leave us? Well, we're in a pretty precarious position. The world's major nuclear powers are no longer bound by formal limits. Accusations of secret testing are flying, and there's no clear path to a new arms control agreement. Daryl Kimball from the Arms Control Association put it well. Simply complaining about potential treaty violations doesn't solve the problem. He's calling for a more sensible approach, like bilateral talks between the US and Russia to continue respecting the core limits of New START, even if it's not officially in force. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to nuclear weapons, the stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just about politics or military strategy. It's about preventing a new arms race that could put the entire world at risk. The question is, will cooler heads prevail? Or are we heading into a new era of nuclear uncertainty? What do you think about all this? Should the US push for a new three-way arms control deal with Russia and China? Or is that unrealistic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that matter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.